So whether they were screening the movements of infantry, or chasing Jeb Stuart, or simply leading the army on campaign, how did the U.S. cavalry feed their horses while they were on campaign, away from the stockpiles of grain and mountains of baled hay? This week on the 11th OVC, we are going to dive deep into the two key pieces of equipment that kept the Civil War cavalry horses fed: the picket pin and the lariat. So baled hay and grain were definitely available to the cavalry horses while in camp or at an established fort or outpost. However, keeping the horses full with enough calories and nutrition each day on campaign proved to be very difficult, if not impossible, commonly running horses into the ground. So even Jeb Stuart comments a few times in letters that he would ride hard for a few days and have his cavalry troopers ride hard for a few days, but he would need to stop for an entire day or two to rest the horses to, quote, regain their constitution. From personal experience, whether on week-long campaigns or hunting expeditions, each day of saddling my horse results in a few inches lost in the girth. It is extremely hard to work the horses hard all day and give them enough calories and nutrition at night to fully recover for the next day's ride. So in order to answer this question, let's start with what the manual said and the intent of what the troopers were supposed to do. Our answer is found within the two pieces of standard issue equipment that the military gave the troopers upon mustering, to allow horses to graze while in the field. These two pieces of equipment were, of course, the lariat and the picket pin. So the use of both of these together allowed each horse to naturally graze in a 30-foot circle, because it was a 30-foot rope, held in place by a pin in the center. This method of allowing horses to graze while still preventing them from running off has been around for centuries before the Civil War and is actually pretty frequently used even today. So this method is better than hobbles, for those of you who are familiar with hobbles, as it makes the horse stay in one area, while hobbles restrain the movement of the horse but still allow the horse to travel great distances if not kept in check. However, one of the major drawbacks to picketing a horse with the lariat and the picket pin is that an untrained horse can easily get tied up and cause rope burns, which can take the horse out for hard military service. So what did the standard issue cavalry lariat actually look like, and was it actually used for the intended purpose? Made from the best hemp available, this 30-foot long piece of rope allowed for hundreds of thousands of cavalry horses to eat when the column was not on the move. It was not initially intended for high lines, which are used to stretch between two high points and keep the horses on a line together in a small area available when needed. One thing that also gives us some insight in the intent of this equipment and how it's supposed to be used is that the 1862 Ordnance Manual specifically states that the standard complement of equipment for the cavalry trooper included the following: one bridle, one watering bridle, one halter, one saddle, one pair of saddle bags, one saddle blanket, one surcingle, one pair of spurs, a curry comb, horse brush, one picket pin, one lariat, and when specifically required, one link and one nose bag. So now exactly how common was it for a trooper to receive an entire set of gear? That's something we'll have to cover in a different episode. But for the simple answer, in poring over every single ordnance return of the war over the past few months, the answers are resounding: not very common for one trooper to receive every piece of gear that was specified in the Ordnance Manual. So of course, as many of you know, the watering bridle, for example, rarely showed up in any large numbers in the quarterly returns of the cavalry regiments throughout the war. However, one thing was for sure in poring over all of these ordnance returns through the war: the lariat specifically was considered a standard piece of gear that most units actually did retain through most of the war. So the 1862 manual specifies that it must be a length of 30 feet, a circumference of 1.25 inches, and must consist of 4 strands, not the normal 3. It must also have an eye spliced in one end and the other end whipped with a small twine. The weight should be as close to 2.38 pounds when possible. So another thing to note is that the references actually specify that the end of the lariat should be tied or basically spliced through the picket pin, thus making it a semi-permanent marriage between the two pieces of equipment. However, in looking at the ordnance returns and using common experience with this equipment, this was not the case in the field. So the reason I bring up the intent or the ordnance manual specifications of semi-permanently splicing the lariat into the actual picket pin, even though it may not have been done in the field, was to talk about or to really bring out the intent of what the military wanted the picket pin and lariat to be used for. Obviously, there is some benefit to leaving the lariat and the picket pin separate, and simply running the lariat through the ring of the pin when needing to graze your horse was, in my opinion, commonly done. But either way, the design requirements of splicing it through that ring of the picket pin proves that the primary intent of the picket pin and lariat was not to use it as a high line or a picket line, but to allow the horse to picket and graze freely without having to run off. So all of this seems great. For those of you who picket your horses today, you understand how great and easy it is to do so with your pack string in the mountains. However, there is a huge problem that we have to talk about when the picket rope concept is scaled up to the numbers of horses used during the American Civil War. So a horse on this 30-foot picket line creates a 60-foot diameter circle. That means that only 6 horses can fit across the length of a standard 360-foot long football field. Combine that with only fitting 2.5 horses across the 160-foot width of that same football field. That means that the entire standard football field in America today could only hold about 16 horses when on campaign and grazing fully on their 60-foot diameter picket rope. So another way to look at this is that an entire acre of land can only support about 16 horses on their full picket rope. As you can see, when you scale this up for a full regiment of about 500 mounted troopers, you would need 31 acres of land to properly picket all the horses of that regiment. One thing that I found interesting is when you look at how many horses were present at specifically the Battle of Gettysburg, the numbers are staggering. The space needed to graze the estimated 3,000 or so horses of Buford's cavalry alone would have taken up the area almost the size of Pickett's charge. The fact that Buford was just a small fraction of the whole army exposes the truth that the troopers could not have commonly used their full lariat and picket pin as it was originally intended. The publication, History of the 9th New York Cavalry by Newell Cheney, gives a better picture of what the, quote, standard way to feed the horses might have been. No sooner had the picket ropes been stretched and the horses been unsaddled and hitched when the men hurried to an adjacent field of wheat, ready cut and bound, and brought enough to feed the horses liberally. Then started after the pigs, chickens, etc., which made a very satisfactory addition to their rations of hardtack. So while it's only one sentence in an entire 500-page book, this simple quote specifically describes the common way that those cavalry troopers fed their horses when stopping on the march. They would, quote, stretch the ropes, which indicates that they would tie them up as high lines and then manually cut enough hay for their mounts to be described as liberal portions. Similar accounts can be found throughout the accounts of Civil War cavalry. But, on the other hand, I've yet to come across a single first-hand account describing the intended or proper way of using the picket pin and lariat. When finding this out, I assumed then that soldiers probably kept the picket rope or lariat and disposed of their picket pin relatively quick throughout the war. Let's see what the ordnance returns show. So I pored over every single cavalry ordnance return through the entire war and found some interesting data. The numbers of picket pins were almost identical to the numbers of lariats reported in each company up until the first quarter of 1864. Of course, I'm averaging out each regiment through the entire war, but the fact remains that the numbers of picket pins still in the field through the war match that of the picket ropes or the lariats throughout pretty much more than the entire half of the war, which indicates through up until that point, through the first quarter of 1864, they actually probably used the picket pin. Otherwise, they would just dispose of it. However, something interesting occurs in the ordnance returns starting in the first quarter of 1864. The numbers of picket pins drop dramatically, while lariats themselves kept basically at the same rate. Another common trend was that the vast majority of regiments were, quote, in the field through the rest of the war. I assume this is because they had fixed or established facilities for their mounts wherever they were posted. So taking this all in, they must have used the pin and the lariat in the first half of the war or so, in the more traditional sense, in the way it was intended to be used. And this is all interesting because looking at the ordnance returns is one of the things that gives you an idea of what they actually carried in the field. Not what was contracted out, not what was in the stores of the Washington Arsenal or the other arsenals out there, but it helps you realize what they actually used in in the field. And up until January of the first quarter of 1864, the picket pins and lariat numbers matched almost identical. Not always, but pretty close to being very much the same. And like I said before, after that, most cavalry regiments reported that they were, quote, in the field, in addition to their picket pins dramatically disappearing while keeping their lariats. The picket pins themselves were composed of a black painted forged, yes I said forged, iron pin, and the ordnance manual specifies that it must have a distinct body, neck, head, and swell. It must also have a lariat ring around the neck that is in the shape of an 8 with the larger opening for the lariat itself. The dimensions included a 14-inch length, a swell about 4 inches from the point that was about 3/4 of an inch, and diameter of about 1/2 inch at the neck with a 1-inch diameter at the head. It was finished with a welded wire ring that was twisted to a diameter of 1 inch. The entire pin was supposed to weigh about 1.25 pounds. So now, with all that being said, let's talk about the real-world use of the lariat and picket pin. I personally grew up in the mountains of Wyoming, taking pack trips in the Rocky Mountains about every summer. One of the first things you always teach your horse in the mountains is to picket and hobble so they can be able to do both. In fact, it takes up multiple pages in the Bible of packing called Horses, Hitches, and Rocky Trails. So after becoming a living historian and using 100% quality 4-strand hemp rope, exactly as the Ordnance Department specifies, the exact same result or lessons learned that I learned as a kid in the Rockies happened. It only takes a few uses to get wet and rotten and deteriorated to a point to cause the rope to break under the slightest pull or tug of your horse. We personally experienced this on one of our campaign events last year, where we were using rope on all of our mounts that had actually been through 5 or 6 campaigns or very muddy events. Our horses kept popping the rope and breaking it throughout the night when they were grazing, causing the horses to get loose and a busy shift for the night watches and guards. We quickly realized that the lariats were really only good for about a month of actual field use, after which it would deteriorate, not necessarily get rotten, but just get soaked and hard and brittle, which actually made it easy to break. So let's take this concept that we learned through real life and actual use and predict that the more the troopers used their lariats, the more they would deteriorate, break, and then be disposed of. The question is, was it at a rate that the Army was able to resupply, or did the numbers of lariats throughout the war deteriorate throughout the war? So the quicker they break, the harder it would be for the quartermaster to resupply them in the field. So my hypothesis is that the numbers of lariats would progressively decrease as the war went on. So let's see what the actual numbers were. As you can see, a clear trend appeared once we plugged every single company of cavalry that had turned in their quarterly numbers through the war. So starting in quarter 4 of 1862, you had about 1,000 companies reporting about 23,000 lariats. In 1863, through quarter 1 through 4, you had 24,000 lariats, 27,000 lariats, 30,000 lariats, and then 28,000 lariats. So looking at those numbers, you may think, oh, they actually grew in numbers throughout the war rather than decreasing. But we have to compare this to the amount of companies or men reporting in those quarterly ordnance returns. When I actually do a ratio of lariats per company, this is what I came up with. In quarter 4 of 1862, they had 22 lariats per company overall through all the cavalry regiments that actually issue their quarterly ordnance returns. In 1863 through quarter 1, the number goes from 19, then an 18, then in quarter 3 of 1863 it drops to 16 lariats per company, then in quarter 4 of 1863 it drops to 14. Now if you look in 1864, quarter 1, it bumps up to 20 lariats per company. The reason it jumps up to 20 is because in that quarter alone, only about 500 companies actually turned in their quarterly ordnance returns, or at least what I could find in the Library of Congress. And this small sample size compared to the about 1,000 to 1,500 companies that I normally saw in each quarter made this probably an anomaly. But if you take a look, the trend continues as if that was just an anomaly. Because in quarter 2 of 1864, it drops right back down to 11 lariats per company. And then in quarter 3 of 1864, it drops to 9 lariats per company, right in line with the trend through the entire Civil War. So this is one area where experiential archaeology actually holds true. For a variety of reasons, the lariat progressively diminished in each company throughout the war. I don't know about you, but I find this pretty interesting that we're able to experience it, predict through experience what actually happened. Again, like I said, predict what the actual war and the troopers would have experienced, go to the original ordnance returns, and actually hold true and discover that what we thought was true. Now, whether it was because the ropes were deteriorated and they broke easy and the quartermaster couldn't replenish them, I don't know, that's up for speculation, but either way, the prediction of diminishing throughout the war, again, was true. So the answer to our original question of how the cavalry kept their horses fed on campaign without running off is ultimately a bit more complex than one single answer. You could answer it with the simple idea that they were issued the lariat and the picket pin, and therefore they were using that to allow the horses to graze. You would also be right if you said that the soldiers disposed of their picket pins and highlined their horses, cut enough grass for their mounts, and placed it at the feet of their tied up horses. This is why diving into primary source material can be so fun, by learning what should have been versus what was modified and learning the nuances of the daily lives of the soldiers. The unrelatable and seemingly sterile history of the Civil War fades away and a colorful, intriguing image is revealed. The final answer to the question revolves around what unit you are looking at and what month or year you are looking at when they were fighting. Thanks again for watching and subscribing to our channel. Your likes, comments, and interaction keeps us motivated to continue bringing you stories of the American Civil War cavalry trooper. Please like us on Facebook, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and please comment below. And until next time, ride hard.